Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 6 presentation. We're going to be looking today at this idea of social and emotional development in childhood. Okay, so the last presentation was on the physical and cognitive development during childhood, and today we're going to kind of look at how we see that manifest in their social world and in the development of their emotional capacities. Alright, grab a coffee, grab a chair, or whatever, and let's get into it. So one of the things is, I think, and I hope you find interesting about this course, is we're kind of continually flipping between these ideas of like the developing physical cognitive self and then the developing social emotional self. Now, again, you already know this, but it's only a theoretical distinction. Obviously, we're just talking about one organism, but it is useful to kind of, if you're going to look at the physical and the cognitive and the emotional and the social, this kind of physical cognitive and then emotional social A B kind of setup makes sense, because one is talking about sort of the under the water changes, right? So like the changes, if you're talking about an iceberg, so that's like the changes in the cognitive system and the changes in the physical body, like the changes of you, and then how that kind of manifests in your social and emotional engagement with your reality. And a part of this is, we've been talking about this in the last chapter that was about social and emotional stuff, which was chapter 4, I believe. And it was in talking about that in infancy, and we talked about the idea of trust and the risk of developing mistrust, and we talked about autonomy and the risk of developing feelings of shame if that's not established. So at this stage, we're looking at this idea of self-understanding. Okay, so we're going to get to Erickson in just one sec, but this idea of self-understanding, and I want you to have this definition because this is, I think, a neat way of thinking about it. It's your cognitive representation of who you are. And I want to just pause for a second, and not to get too deep on slide 2, but it's pretty wild to think that we have a cognitive representation of who we think we are. And I would argue that that's not necessarily the same thing as your true self. And what even is yourself? And, you know, if this is, there's so many layers here, because as the child now is starting to broaden how they see themselves, they're starting to broaden who is feeding into their story of who they are. And the amount of people feeding into that story is getting bigger, right? Because at the beginning it was mainly parents' immediate family. Now it's getting, well, now they're going to school. Now they're being exposed to media at a heightened level, right? So this, and all that stuff is part of their psychosocial world. And so now they're dealing with these key developmental struggles, like Erickson would say, right, in his model, his developmental stage model, that at every point in life we're dealing with something. And kids at this age are dealing with this idea of establishing initiative. And his idea was that if they're not able to do that, they can have these internal feelings of guilt. And then the second idea is this establishing this sense of industry. And over the next few slides, I'm going to break down what this means, but that the risk of a failure to establish that was this idea of inferiority, or the inferiority complex concept, which actually somebody else developed. I think Adler, I'll have to look that up quick. I should have looked that up before, but the inferiority complex is an application of Erickson's concept. But at some point maybe we'll talk about what a complex means, but just think about it as like a buried energy memory, maybe. I love this class. All right, next slide. One thing that I've always, and I hope you appreciate this too, or can benefit from this too. I mean, one way I often try to teach at Conestoga is by really focusing on understanding what the actual words mean. And sometimes even words that we think we know, it's helpful to kind of break them down, because when we break them down and fully understand the word, then remembering the definition attached to the word becomes very easy. And the reason I'm starting with this preamble is to say, what would it mean to you if you went to work and the new person that you hired at work, your boss came up and was like, this new employee really lacks initiative, right? So if you're thinking about that, what that means is this idea of like, they need to be told to do everything. You need to be watching them all the time. They can't just go and, you can't just give them a job and they go and do it. So what Erickson's saying, that's just to explain the word initiative. So initiative's like, if I was to say, like for the Giants of Psychology project, you all showed great initiative. I basically gave you a target and you all hit it. And it's like that ability to take a task and complete a task, basically, is initiative. By early childhood, children use their perceptual, motor, cognitive, and language skills to make things happen and begin to become convinced that they're their own person. They have a surplus of energy that permits them to approach new areas, even some things that are dangerous. Right? And that's like, with a kid this age myself, it's like that's one of the hardest things, right? It's like Evie wants to do everything on her own, and I'm still the dad that, like, I've probably said this to you already, but that like gets nervous every time she climbs up a ladder without my hand on her back, right? So it's like I want to like run up and help her, or like even I wasn't gonna talk about this. I'm on it on like the second slide, but like it's like this has been a rough week with her. Sometimes in the morning, right? But it's like I need to help her develop that initiative, that ability to understand that when she focuses on things, she can focus on something and complete the task. That she doesn't always need me. You can actually look at this as an emerging beginning stage of independence. And when I'm saying independence, I'm meaning at a behavioral level, and also very much though at like a psychological level, that they're starting to see that they can choose things. Like this initiative and the next one, industry, really go together. The initiative is almost like the self-startingness of it, right? So if the opposite to the example I started this slide with would be if you said that the new person at your work has great initiative, meaning like you can be like, you know, go do this, and they go and do a great job, and they maybe have new ideas about how to do it, and you know, you can basically just give them a list of things and trust that they'll do it. And then if kids don't develop that, they can feel guilt about not having that ability. Now, you'll notice both of these things are linked with school. And that a big piece of this is physical. So it's interesting, right? Because the slide there says physical activities are a central component of the self in early childhood, right? So who they think of themselves is deeply tied to what they see as their ability to perform tasks and their ability to influence the world. I'm going to kind of bring my camera in and out depending on how much it interferes with the slide. So the idea here is that industry and initiative make the most sense when you view them as two parts of the same thing, sort of, right? Because the initiative is the ability to think like, it's almost like the cognitive motivational aspect. The industry is like the confidence that you can do it. Think of industry as meaning like a factory that builds things. So a child that's industrious or filled of industry is a kid that can do things, can build blocks, can spell words, can read, right? And so a lot of early school is about fostering, and Erickson would say this is what it should be doing, fostering initiative and fostering industry. According to Erickson, middle and late childhood is characterized by industry versus inferiority, this idea. This term Industry expresses a dominant theme of this period, that children become interested in how things are made and how they work. When children are engaged in their efforts to make and build and work, whether building a model airplane, constructing a treehouse, fixing a bike, solving math problems, or cooking, that sense of industry, of being able to affect their environment intentionally, increases. The sense of industry increases. Right? Conversely, parents who always see their children's efforts at doing things or making things or building things as mischief or making a mess will tend to foster a sense of inferiority in their children. Okay, so this slide might be a little bit of a long one. I know my camera here cuts off just the last word there. It says rather than absolute terms, terms like T-E-R-M-S. Okay, that's the only word that's covered there. So we have this, okay, so here's where things are getting an increasing level of complexity, because how the child's seeing themselves is starting to include this social component I've been talking about. And, well, let me just read this for a sec. Two main differences are evident when contrasting self-descriptions provided during early childhood with those in middle childhood. So self-descriptions are something that are commonly referred to in developmental psych because, well, think of what a self-description is, right? If we're talking about their sense of self, them describing who they think they are is our clearest way of understanding how they're processing their experience at that level, right? So again, there's two main differences in how kids, as they start to get older, make sense of themselves. The first is a shift from describing oneself in more concrete ways to describing themselves in more comparative ways. So what that means is, instead of saying I'm smart, it's that I'm smarter than these people and not as smart as these people. Okay, so this is the critical point. In some ways, this is the critical point of this whole lecture, but the critical point of this slide specifically is this idea of this beginning of the person's sense of who they are really taking this significant social variable, right, and starting to be comparison based. Now, this is going to come, this has huge ramifications for things like self-esteem and all kinds of body image related stuff, all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of stuff that we would potentially consider problematic, potential things that people deal with. This whole fact that so much of our struggle sometimes as humans comes from this idea of trying to, satisfy whatever we think everybody wants from us. And it's like, this starts really young. That starts so young. And they start to realize like that it's this comparative system. And you might have heard me say this before, but it's like you ask a group of kids how good they are at soccer, and depending on their age, it's like a lot of times what they answer is kind of just how much they think they are, how good they think they are compared to their immediate friend group, right? So if it's like a group of kids that are all elite soccer players, but they all play together all the time, the one that's the worst might feel, if you ask him, like he's no good, even though he's elite. It's that the scale of reference, right? So it's like, for kids, that scale of reference, that's what it means when it says it moves away from a more absolute, like I'm this score on a rating, to more comparative, like I'm better than these people and worse than these people. In middle and late childhood then, especially from the years 8 to 11, children increasingly start to describe themselves with psychological characteristics, rather than these more concrete self-descriptions of younger children. Older children are more likely to describe themselves as popular or nice or helpful or smart or dumb. In addition, during the elementary school years, children become more likely to recognize the social aspects of their self, they include a reference to maybe their social group in their self-description, like calling themselves a Girl Guide or a Catholic or someone that has 2 friends. Children's self-understanding in the elementary school years includes an increased reference to social comparison. Right, so self-understanding in elementary school years includes this increasing social comparison piece. And this comparative piece overtakes absolute terms. So I know that, I don't know if this rant has been concise, but basically what I'm trying to say is those 2 things together are really important, because the comparison becomes important, and at the same time the comparison get important, the tie to absolute reality, or like an objective actual score, becomes less important. So it's not even if they're really cool or good looking or good at sports or good at math or whatever, it's how they rate compared to their friends. So this gets even more complicated, because then, and you may have seen this coming, that I was going to talk about self-esteem, but what happens then is this emerging conception of who we are, this recognition or cognitive representation of self. The child starts to add a certain amount of value to that. And the value added to that, the amount of esteem or status, another way you could say it, attached to their cognitive representation of self is more specifically what people, at least theoretically, mean when they say self-esteem. That self-esteem refers to this. And I'm going to get into some of the complexity around self-esteem in a second, but self-esteem relates to this idea of a global evaluation of self. So what that means is it's different. Global is a word in this sense that means across the board, and it means like kind of the opposite of specific. So global and specific are sort of 2 ends. So like a specific evaluation of self would be more like the concept of self-efficacy, where it's like your confidence to do something specific or something like that. Whereas a global evaluation of self means self-esteem is sort of what you think of yourself in general. And of course that's going to have, it's going to be influenced by a whole bunch of things, and that a kid starts to add this value, I have up on the screen, even if they think of themselves as a good person or not. And this is super important going forward, because we know that kids with low self-esteem is linked with all kinds of the things that you would fear as a parent, right? And why I'm taking extra time kind of talking about this now is to really link this with the last slide, and this idea of these things go together. The kid's emerging idea of who they are, their cognitive representation of self, self-concept, starts to get this social dimension, right? So sometimes I use the word self-concept more generally there. This word self-concept, this idea is sometimes used to talk about, like, you have these, okay, so I'm just going to try to distinguish this. What's the difference between a self-concept and self-esteem? Self-concept is like how you feel about how you are in all these areas, right? So a kid might have a self-concept about how they are at math, and how they are as an athlete, and how they are at talking in front of people, and how they are at, singing or whatever. And it's like they have these concepts of all this, and then there's like this next level of how they feel about all that. They might be, because it might be that they feel that they're bad at this, and do they even care? Because that's an interesting thing with self-esteem too. So for example, if you grow up in a family where your parents are all about hockey, it's all about you playing hockey, you have to play hockey, and you're not good at hockey, that can have a huge effect on your self-esteem. If you grow up in a family that no one cares about hockey, and no one cares if you play hockey, it's not going to have any effect on your self-esteem. So it's very contextually based. And it's very much a read of what we think the people around us care about. And this is an early introduction of this idea that this can be associated with all kinds of negative mental health when we have a distortion in how we keep perspective about other people, right? And we're talking still, like, it's like I'm kind of getting off track because I'm talking almost about how this applies to adults, but it's like we're talking about a young child and that they're first getting at this stage of caring about how other people are seeing them at a much deeper psychological level. Improving self-esteem and focusing on that's always a good thing, right? You can probably tell I'm setting you up as a trick question. It's like you would assume, right? Like, of course, developing self-esteem sounds like something that should be good, and especially if a kid has had a life path that has led them to have a low self-esteem. In those situations specifically, it's really important that you understand where that low self-esteem is coming from, and you provide them social support and stuff like that. But aside from that, there's some really specific concerns about taking a self-esteem development approach to kind of society and recreational activities and sports and everything in general, right? And kind of joking with this image on the slide of like, here's your ribbon, you did a thing. It's like there's a risk in that, even though it's well intended. Teachers, social workers, healthcare professionals, and others are often concerned about low self-esteem in the children that they're supporting. One temptation then is to deliver more frequent praise, but a growing body of research suggests caution in this approach. You don't have to write this down. I just thought you'd find this interesting. Too many of today's children are growing up receiving praise for even mediocre or a poor performance, and as a consequence have inflated self-esteem. They therefore in the future can have difficulty handling competition and criticism. If parents are narcissistic and especially overvalue their own children's talents, this can add to it. This is vividly captured in the book called The Dumbing Down of Our Kids, which is subtitled Why American Children Feel Good About Themselves But Can't Read, Write, or Add. It's a really interesting book. In a series of studies, researchers found that inflated praise, so like telling kids that they're awesome even when they can tell that the other kids are better than them, that this inflated praise, although well-intended, can cause children with lowest self-esteem to actually avoid important learning experiences and actually avoid challenging tasks. You're praising them anyways, regardless of how hard, right? There's a danger in not focusing on merit. A study by Kang Lee and others at the University of Toronto in 2017 provides a poignant example of how the type of praise delivered influences a child's behavior. Preschool children played a game and were praised in one of two ways. Okay, so these kids played a game and they were given positive reinforcement in one of two ways. Some children were praised for their ability, like you say, like as in contrast to their effort. So it's like, oh, my daughter draws a picture and I'm like, oh, you're so smart. It's your innate talent that did that. Whereas others were praised for their performance, like you did very well this time. So the difference here is one group praised for their ability, one group praised for their specific performance on that task, like coloring or whatever. Children who were praised for their ability were more likely to cheat when given an opportunity to do so than were the children who were praised for their performance, consistent with previous evidence that praising children for intelligence can undermine task enjoyment and can reduce persistence after failure. That was when it says consistent with previous evidence, that was from a study by Mueller in 1998. This study calls for a very thoughtful approach when praising children. Praising a child for being smart can produce pressure to perform well in the future in order to meet others' expectation. And this pressure can lead to these negative behaviors, like the increased likelihood to cheat, because the only thing that matters is the high mark, not the process. So it's kind of interesting, right? That when if you focus just on that, it's just kind of a warning about how we use reward systems, and be careful what we're rewarding, and be careful on how that's shaping behavior. Yeah, so in general, self-esteem development is important, but it has to be real. The kid has to feel like it isn't fake, basically. And if they feel it's fake, it can have a counterproductive. And doing it when it's fake and telling people that they're doing a great job when they're not can actually set them up for some success, because they don't learn how to get better sometimes. It's almost midnight. Wife and kid are in bed. Got a nice hot coffee. Talking a little layers of mind. Life's not that bad. All right. Sorry for that. Development of self-efficacy. Think about this word differently. Self-efficacy, you've heard this term before. It's Bandura's word, right? And I want to really highlight the first part of that, self, right? How good this is linked with self-esteem. Do they think that they can do what they try to do? And you've heard this idea before, but the reason I'm hitting it again is because it's positioned here chronologically in the development of the kid, right? So this is where this comes in, right? So earlier when we were talking about kind of the beginning couple lectures, we talked a little bit more about Bandura, and I think I touched on the self-efficacy idea already, but it's valuable to double back to, right? So self-efficacy is this idea that's more specific than confidence. It's like your belief in your ability to perform a certain specific task. I'll just read this again. Self-efficacy is the belief that one can master a situation and produce a favorable outcome. So that at a certain point, it's like, do you look at like that final exam video I just did? Can you just like get the question and go and start taking some notes and start preparing something, submit it, and just get your mark and just be like, okay, next, right? And if you say yes to that, that's like, okay, well, that's a demonstration of a high level of self-efficacy. And well, a high level of self-efficacy is that belief that you can do that. So actually, just the way I said that, I kind of wasn't clear, but how I wasn't clear is sort of interesting there, because it's the difference between competency, the actual ability to do it, and the belief in the ability to do it. Self-efficacy is the belief in the ability to do it, but that those things aren't completely distinct, because the belief in the ability to do it affects the potential of it actually being achieved. Right? So what we find is that people that score higher in self-efficacy will persist longer at things. They'll fail longer to get a success. Whereas people that don't think that they can succeed will quit earlier. They'll take earlier any negative feedback as indication of an upcoming failure that people with higher self-efficacy scores would fight through. Right, so it's this very important cognitive difference between viewing things as a threat or as a challenge. And a big piece of that is how you see your own belief, your belief in your own ability to master a situation, to overcome and to produce a favorable result. At the simplest level, can you accomplish what you're trying to do? Can you have a goal? Can you complete your goal? Self-regulation. Now, you may be thinking like, okay, we've already talked about self-regulation and some of these things, and it's the positionality of why it bears repetition, that this self-regulation is, so say for example, you'll notice the last point there, I say that last week in chapter 4 we talked a lot about this development in the prefrontal cortex. We talked about this increased myelination and all that kind of stuff. But my point is that all of that is the physical and cognitive development that's connected with then this increased ability to exert emotional control. And this is one of these examples of where changes inside are manifesting in changes outside. This increased myelination in the prefrontal cortex is actually letting the kid focus more, calm down better, right? So self-regulation, again, just remember this is meaning like where the term comes from is the word regular, right? To get back to normal, right? So you're all of a sudden really upset and can you calm back down? Can you do it by yourself? Can you self-regulate, right? And remember, compared to like an earlier child that maybe needs the parent to soothe them, to calm down, right? Can you use a deliberate effort to manage your own behavior? Can you think about what you want to do and do it even when your emotions are strong? Because this idea is that's the ability to self-regulate is highly linked with what we would consider like social competence, the ability to navigate the social world, right? Because, and we talked about this at length in that hot cognition presentation, that's basically what it was about, is that hot cognition compromises your ability to make rational, logical decisions because you're overweighing emotional content, you're overvaluing emotional content. It's not necessarily that you're overvaluing it. Your cognitive system is being harnessed by it, I think is the quote from the presentation, and that's the way to say it. So this ability to calm back down, we see it developing as the kids are getting older. And I wanted to double back and highlight this point that that's a thing you see in their behavior that is directly connected to that increased myelination that we talked about last time. So I do this with my students at Conestoga too. I know maybe like YouTube video wise it might be cooler if I go point by point, but if you're taking notes, it's probably helpful if I just throw up the whole slide and then talk for a bit. But this idea of perspective taking, so this is key too. So and this is the kind of dynamic we're talking about today, is the emerging child's sense of self and how that, as that builds and changes, their ability to understand the other changes too. And a big piece of that is this idea of perspective taking. Like, I'm sitting here in Kitchener in my basement. I just said it's like almost midnight or whatever, having a nice hot coffee. It's nice and quiet. Everyone else is sleeping. This is like perfect. It's like, can you picture what it would be like in that scenario? And can I picture what it would be like for you as the student? And can we like try to understand, like, can I try to, one of the reasons I try to talk a little bit about my life or just about what it's like for me doing this and stuff is to just, be sort of human with you a bit more and just not be somebody that reads slides. Like, and I think when we can start to take a little bit of that perspective, the ability to understand each other changes, and that's something that we start to see emerging. As a child gets to this 4 or 5, we start seeing them understand things like psychological traits differently. And part of that, so this is kind of interesting. It's like them understanding themselves and them understanding the other are connected, and we've been talking about this. So this perspective taking is this process of assuming another person's, or being able to kind of picture their thoughts. It's kind of like the cognitive piece of empathy. And so I want to make this point about the kids now start to understand this concept of joint commitment. So it says there that part of perspective taking is understanding joint commitment. So what that means is like a child, say like my daughter's playing with her cousin Penelope, and they're over there and they're coloring. And I'm like, Evie, come here. And I try to get her to play over here, and she's like, well, I can't. I'm playing with Penelope. It's like, that's an example of a joint commitment, right? Like in her head, even though she like paused or whatever to listen to what I'm saying, she was going back to that. And that, think about that for a sec. It's like that whatever pulled her back to that is actually like a cognitive energy almost. It's a joint commitment is what they call it. But this is like a cognitive psychology idea, is that there's like a piece of her bandwidth, brain power directed towards staying connected with that, even though she momentarily broke. It's a pretty neat idea, and that they're developing that. They also start to understand, so this is where at the start there, I kind of didn't describe the first point because it kind of links more with down here, that by the time the kid gets to 4 or 5, that they start describing themselves in psychological terms, or they might say something like, you know, my daughter today, I'll save the story, but yeah, they might say something like, this person's nice, but she kind of lies. The kid starts to realize people can say things that aren't true. I can say things that aren't true. So this is kind of interesting too. So as the kid starts to realize that they can lie, they start to realize that other people can lie. And, you could call, I have there, it's like the birth of skepticism. This idea that understanding that other people don't always give accurate reports on what they think about things. And that the depth of this that I'm trying to kind of highlight is this idea that the only reason we understand at a certain level, right? And we're talking about this emerging in kids, but the only reason the kid can understand that other people might be lying to them is because they understand that they're sometimes lying. Or not necessarily lying, that's maybe an extreme way of saying it, but they're maybe saying they're okay when they're not. And that kind of teaches them that other people are doing that too. Again, this is perspective taking, this developing ability to take the other's perspective literally. Sorry to say that a bunch of different times, but it's a cognitive mechanism that evolves at this stage that's associated with the development of the prefrontal cortex. So I just re-listened to that last slide, and I was quite ranty, but I ended up with calling it a cognitive mechanism, and I think that's a good, think of it as like the machinery almost, and even if it's just a useful metaphorical way to talk about it, it's like two parts of that cognitive mechanistic way that this is happening, right? So think of that joint attention, or that ability to see something from my perspective includes a couple things. First of all, so let's say, for example, your ability to see things how I must be experiencing it demands that at first, at a certain level, you inhibit your current perspective and then you try to take on mine. Now again, obviously I'm not talking about like you going into some trance and like we're obviously talking about like a thought exercise, right? But we actually do this all the time. We underestimate how much we do this kind of stuff that's actually quite interesting psychologically. So the idea here is like, if you do actually picture what something's like me, you almost have to try to put yourself in that position. You almost have to inhibit your cognitions. Right, so it says controlling one's thoughts to consider the perspective of others. Like, allow yourself to, Carl Rogers, the great psychologist, would say, enter the other person's world as if it's your own, without losing the as if part of that sentence. And that also demands this idea of cognitive flexibility. Right, so this is kind of like saying some of the stuff we're talking about, some of these changes in how the kid is experiencing their emotionality and their socialness, their social world, and their life basically is related to these developing cognitive capabilities. So an early aspect of the child's understanding of who they are is this idea that they start to notice that there's males and females. And I remember my daughter would have fallen pretty much in line with this. I think she was actually younger. I think by the time she was able to talk, basically, she would have been able to tell you which of her cousins were boys and girls, which were girls. And this categorical ability comes very early. This sense of being male or female, which most children acquire by the time they're 3 years old, is the gender identity. And they're also, what I was just saying was this also ability to categorize it in others. So this whole idea of what gender is gets developed in children very early. In addition to that, there's this idea of gender roles. Now, I know, and you know too, that obviously there's a lot of discussion that can be had about all of these things, and about, we're going to talk in a second about this idea of gender roles, and that as kids are growing up, they're exposed to different ideas of what boys are supposed to do and what girls are supposed to do, and there's conversations to be had about, if that's right or how we should view that. But the point that I'm making in this course, so for example, in like my social issues class at Conestoga, we talk about stuff like that. The point to make in this course, though, that is really important is whatever the society is presenting gets internalized by the children really young. So I'm not taking this from a moral perspective, but I am taking this from the perspective of this is imprinting on the child early, and let's look at that. Okay, so in terms of gender, and I had mentioned this as being a complex topic that clearly has biological and evolutionary components that are highly significant, but there's also social ways of looking at this idea, and I wanted to kind of look at 3 different interesting perspectives of this. Okay, so we're going to look at social role theory, we're going to look at the psychoanalytic perspective, and then we're going to look at this social cognitive idea. Okay, so from a social role theory, in some ways this is the easiest one to explain, and it's why I have like the kind of like ready, set, action scene of an image on the screen there, like it's a movie set, because social role theory is basically this idea that from the moment kids start to become aware of their social situation, they're being fed information on how they're supposed to categorically behave. Okay, so Alice Eagerly is the person that came up with this idea. That's another person that, if you're looking for an idea for your last topic, that could be an interesting one. So Alice Eagerly, spelled or Egley, there's no R. Her last name spelled Eagly, came up with this idea of social role theory, which states that gender differences come from the contrasting presentation of the roles of men and women in society. So again, this isn't to downplay the obvious kind of evolutionary and biological aspects here, but that there's also this is the nature side, or this is the nurture side, right? So last week, and especially next week when we get into or next time when we get into chapter 7 on puberty, and we start getting into like some of the hormonal and really biochemical aspects of some of this, I want to focus today a little bit about on this idea of the social aspect of this topic. So social role theory, the thing that I want you to remember about that is just what this word role means, right? Like what would it mean to play a role in a movie? If you were going to play a teacher in a scene or play the student in a scene, you would approach it differently, because those words, you would think that those roles are different. This idea is that kids learn that early, observationally, and that's one of the reasons we see them act differently. So that's what we would call social role theory. So of all of Freud's difficult to explain and highly misunderstood theories, this one's high up there. The Oedipus and the Electra stories. So Electra's a complicated figure, though the consuming mother. It's very interesting because in Greek plays, Sophocles, she's a character in these plays, and Oedipus is also from Greek mythology. And what's important to remember is it seems weird, right? Why would Freud, when trying to explain these kind of layers of mind and how gender in this, like you've heard people use terms like daddy issues or stuff like that, and it's like, this is where this comes from. And so Freud's making this reference to these old stories, and it might sound weird, like why is Freud referencing these ancient Greek stories? But remember, obviously this is before TV and before internet, and the Greek plays were things that the intellectuals at Freud's time all knew about. And so these were references that people would understand. It'd be like if I was saying, okay, say we're teaching some class on the future of technology, and I was saying about how, this social credit score, like that crazy Black Mirror episode. Have you seen that episode? And you're like, yeah, I've seen that episode. And I'm like, okay, well, kind of like that. This is what Freud's doing. And he's saying that when there's disturbances, especially, now remember, and this is where I'm going to be sensitive in explaining this slide, but remember that oftentimes Freud was very aware of the link between especially child maltreatment and psychological trauma. And again, attraction, it's like such a loaded word because people assume that what it also is this idea of people, it's modeling this. What I mean by that is like the child, when the child's young, Freud's idea was like that there's an attraction there, but that understanding that is like sexual attraction is not understanding the depths of what he means. It's at a more psychological, physical, psychodynamic level. Again, if you're interested in this at all, if you're not, you're like probably like, will Mike ever be done this slide? And if you're noticing I'm kind of all over the place, it's like this is a complicated idea to understand. To really get into it, we would need to start with both of these stories, explain what both of these characters mean, right? Oedipus gets like basically tricked into sleeping with his mother and then ends up digging his own eyes out because he's so upset about it. It's like a very complicated myth by itself, let alone Freud trying to use that to explain differences in young children's behaviors. Like the complexity is deep here. So next slide. So then the third one of these social theories of gender, which are being presented in the nurture side of this gender discussion, is this idea of social cognitive theory, that the development of gender is both social in where the information is coming from, and remember social cognitive, how like our thinking is socially embedded, that children's gender development occurs within through their observation and their imitation of what they see other people doing, that they actually get rewarded for behaving in gender specific ways, or perhaps de-incentivized from performing, or behaving in quote unquote gender inappropriate ways, right? So social theories of gender, or social cognitive theory, is this idea that they're learning what is allowed So again, this is the nurture side of why do, to just simplify for a sec, it's like, why do boys maybe play more with trucks and girls with dolls? From a social cognitive perspective, we'd be saying that since the kid was born, they've been being told that that's what they do. Now again, remember my warning at the very beginning of this course. It's almost never nature or nurture. It's almost always some complex interplay. The book talks about some interesting things here about how mothers and fathers, again, these are broad stroke generalizations, but in many cultures, mothers socialize their daughters to be more obedient and responsible than their sons. And this is an interesting point. And they also tend to place more restrictions on the daughter's autonomy, right? So they might let their, for example, boys go out and play longer or with less restrictions, or be less concerned who's around them, or to be whatever, and just more strict with the daughter. Now again, the why to that is going to look at some of the maybe social reasons for that, maybe some of the evolutionary reasons for that. In developmental psychology, what we're looking at really isn't as much the why, but the what, or the what do we see when we look at father relationships to kids and mother relationship to kids, and we look at hundreds of thousands of them and we try to look for patterns. One of the patterns we see is that moms tend to be over strict on daughters. Or not necessarily even over strict, as if I'm making some kind of value judgment. What I should say is more strict on daughters than on sons. So when we do these kind of time log related studies, where you basically are looking at like how much time, how much activity, how much attention, how much of each day that is spending with the kids, and again, this is when we're looking at like kind of cross-cultural developmental psychology, we see that dads tend to spend more time with their sons. And again, it's an in general thing, right? Like, it's weird for me even saying that. Well, I don't have a son, so I don't have that comparison point, but like, I'm with my daughter all the time, and lots of dads are, so. But it's just interesting when you time log it. But see, even me saying that, that's like the classic developmental psychology class comment or question, is because so often our individual experience might go against the average. But that's why it's just the average. It's not like everybody's like this. But fathers tend to also engage in more activities, especially physical activities, tend to be more focused on intellectual development with their kids. So the idea here is that what some people are suggesting is, or the textbook is sort of suggesting, is that some of the, or it's not the textbook necessarily, but the people pushing this nurture perspective of understanding the socialization influence on children, is that some of this fact that boys seem prone to competition and conflict and ego display and risk taking is linked to this difference in how they're being socialized early on. So some additional points on this. The textbook talks about how there's, and you may have noticed this, greater pressure for boys to conform to traditional male roles than for girls to conform to traditional female roles. Again, general statement, but basically the idea is like more kids in the class will probably say something if a boy student wears a dress than if a girl student wears like a hoodie and boy style pants or whatever. That there's, regardless of, it's the why and like all that about it is very interesting. But what we see cross-culturally is this is a consistent trend. Gender differences are averages, not characteristics of all boys and girls. That's an important point. There's considerable gender overlap exists, meaning that, well, and with a lot of these things, that when we talk about the differences between men and women, there's a lot of, there's so much similarity. There's some uniquenesses, and there's definitely, and that's really interesting. And some of these differences may be due to primarily to biological things or sociological things or both, right? So again, a classic nature nurture conflict, or not conflict, but interaction is the word I meant. Another pretty neat idea related to parenting. So I'll put this up. I have a piece that I want to read here, but I'll just kind of give a way of understanding this first. Think about this. It's like the child expresses an emotion. How does the parent engage that? Do they use that as a potential coaching moment? Do they engage it as trying to teach the kid? Right, so I have like that picture that I'm assuming is like a dad and his kid or whatever. It's like, do you take this idea of your job as a parent is to coach this emotional development, or do you sort of dismiss emotions, try to kind of deny or ignore or change negative emotions to just get them to stop? Parents can play an important role in helping young children regulate their emotions. Depending on how they talk to their children about emotions, parents can be described as taking an emotional coaching or emotion coaching, or an emotion dismissing approach. So if you're interested in this and wanted to look more into this, Gottman, so Gottman, this is research from 2016, so if you just put Gottman 2016. The distinction between these approaches is most evident in the way that parents deal with a child's negative emotional expression. So the best way to understand the difference between these two is to look at how parents handle a kid expressing negative emotion, right, which is a difficult situation. Emotion coaching parents monitor their children's emotions, view their children's negative emotions as an opportunity for teaching. Not necessarily always, it's not like they're perfect people, but they try to take this perspective. They try to view their children's negative emotions as an opportunity for teaching, assist them in labeling their emotions so they can help begin to understand it, and coach them in how to deal effectively with those emotions. So taking this like active, like the kid's going to have emotions. They're not doing anything wrong. It's part of being a human being, and part of your role as the parent is to help coach their ability to get better at, well, what we called earlier self-regulation, or basically just handling their emotion. In contrast, emotion dismissing parents view their role as to deny, or not that they would say this. This is saying, like, it's not like if you said to them, what do you think your approach to your kid's emotion is? It's like, it's to deny and ignore and dismiss. It's like, but their behavior shows that that's what their view. In contrast, emotion dismissing parents view their role as to deny, ignore, or change negative emotions. Emotion coaching parents interact with their children in a less rejecting manner, use more of a scaffolding, like a Vygotsky approach, based on praise, and are more nurturant than emotion dismissing parents. Moreover, children of emotion coaching parents are better at soothing themselves when they get upset, are more effective at regulating their negative affect, felt emotion, focus their attention better, have fewer behavioral problems than do children of emotion dismissing parents. Studies have found that father emotion coaching was related to children's social competence, and that mother's emotion coaching was linked to less oppositional behavior. So kind of interesting how those influences are different. Children in elementary school. Here, I'll just get these all up here. Children in elementary school develop an increased ability to understand such complex emotions as pride and shame. So, sorry, I should have started by saying, so here we're talking about this idea of coping with stress in childhood, and that by the time the kid gets to 10, most children have started to develop strategies to cope with stress, and that some of this developing awareness or ability is linked to certain things, and one of them is this improved emotional understanding. They start to understand things like pride and shame, and these emotions become less tied to the reactions of other people. They become more self-generated. Think about that. It's like at first the kid had to be embarrassed by like sort of doing something embarrassing in front of other kids. But they start to get to a point where they start to be able to stress themselves easier out because they're thinking about like, well, if I do that tomorrow at school, that's going to be embarrassing. You can see how this is, well, you can see how that's anxiety. Also, during middle and late childhood, as part of their understanding of emotions, children engage in what you could almost talk of as a mental time travel, in which they anticipate and recall cognitive emotional aspects of events. Right? So that sentence is loaded. Children can engage in mental time travel. So think about when we're either worrying about something that happened and how people think about it, something that happened at school today or whatever. So that's in the past. Or in the future is like worrying about tomorrow, and I don't have, my daughter's worried about, she doesn't have a pink dress and she wants to have a pink dress, and that's stressing her out, and that's anticipatory anxiety. So another thing is that children start to understand that people can have more than one emotion at the same time, that you can be, for example, excited and nervous at the same time. That you can have both joy and anxiety at the same time. There's this increased tendency to be aware of the events leading to emotional reactions. A child in grade 4 may become aware that their sadness today is influenced by a friend moving away to town last week. Right? But they start to understand that like there's this kind of carryover effect, and that their emotional state in the moment is linked with their broader life story. So this emotional complexity around their understanding is just getting so much more dynamic. They're starting to be able to, or the use of self-initiated strategies for redirecting their feelings, that early in the elementary school years, children become more reflective about their emotional lives and increasingly use strategies to control their emotions. I'm not going to keep thinking about that. They become more effective at cognitively managing their emotions, soothing themselves after becoming upset. And then the last one, a capacity for genuine empathy. A child in grade 4, for example, feels sympathy for a distressed person, or can feel, and it can experience vicariously the sadness of that person. So you're seeing this just incredible jump in complexity in how negative emotionality and stressful situations is engaged and understood and dealt with. So moral developments, remember, moral just means right and wrong. Well, I shouldn't say just means, like these are some of the biggest philosophical questions in life, but when we're talking about moral development, we're meaning that the child's idea of what's right and what's wrong is developing, obviously, but it's interesting to kind of just break the words down, and this idea that we're talking about the development of thoughts and feelings and behaviors regarding kind of the rules of what people should do in their interactions with other people, and that some of that is learned, right? And that this is interesting, that the ability to resist temptation. So this is where like the cognitive theorists and maybe like Kohlberg might argue, if you look at his like stages of cognitive development, or his stages of moral development model, that's kind of classic in psychology, where he's saying like maybe kids are getting a better understanding of ethics, and that's why they're behaving in more moral ways as they're getting older. And the social cognitive people are saying, well, maybe, or maybe just their brain is getting more myelinization, and they're actually able to just pay attention better. They're able to resist temptation better. It's actually a cognitive jump, not a, like, for lack of a better word, not, they haven't become like more good. This idea that when they start to understand that, if they say something nice or do something nice or try to help people, that as they start to learn behaviors that will improve another person's emotional state, they start to learn how to be nicer. They start to realize that when you did that to that person, that really hurt their feelings. And they start to kind of make this connection. And again, their understanding of how that affects them and their understanding of how they affect others goes hand in hand. This works okay and comes across. I hope this is like an effective way of doing this. I'm going to use some comparison to TV families, and I hope that I'll explain a little bit, so even if you haven't seen the show, you'll be able to catch the comparison. So Diana Bumrine in 1971 came out with this idea of these different parenting styles, and you maybe most likely heard of them, like authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, which is now sometimes called indulgent, and they now call it neglectful. It used to always be called uninvolved, but same thing. So what she's really saying here, and this is such a foundational idea, and this idea has been replicated and added to, and but why it's continually taught and why it's such a focus is because it actually has, there's a really interesting tidbit in this, or a really interesting essence in this, which is saying, like, okay, you can take every family, all different families, and it doesn't matter where they are in the world or anything like that, and you can basically assess them on two variables, and those variables are going to be, how much emotion do you see expressed in the family? And so there's actually kind of 4 variables that break down into 2, and you don't really need to know this necessarily for like the test or anything, but just so you actually understand it a bit more deeply. There's actually 2 variables. So there's how much open communication is there and how much open positive emotion is there expressed in the family. So so what that means is, if you were sitting there taking notes, and let's say we made tick boxes, and every time you see something that we had already decided would count as emotional expression, you make a tick. And every time you see something that sounded like a warm communication or a positive communication, you make a tick. Okay, so you're recording that. And you can kind of call both of those things, the amount of warm communication, the amount of warm emotion, you can call that kind of like just warm communication. Then on the other side, you're looking at rules. So now this part's kind of interesting. It's like, how clear are the rules? So like what the parents expect from the kids, and how much is how they're going to be enforced consistent. So on this side, that kind of breaks into the 2 of like, how clear are the rules, and how clear is, and how predictable sort of is the enforcement of those rules. So now you have this kind of thing. On this side you have rules as a variable, and on this side you have this kind of warm communication as the variable. So now you can assess any family and basically say, do you see a high presence of this and a high presence of this? Now again, I know I took forever to explain that, but if you kind of get that point, now you're going to hopefully be able to understand these words that you've probably been exposed to before, but hopefully a little bit differently. All right, so we're going to now go through these one by one and talk about how these are different. How these 4 things are different is how they answer those 2 questions. How much warm emotion do we see? How much clarity of rules combined with clear enforcement patterns? The family, our first TV parent here we're going to look at is from That 70s Show. I'm hoping at least a few of you have seen it or watched a ton of it. This show, the parents in this are, Red is the dad, and he's like the classic, and that's kind of the point of the show, right? He's like the classic 70s sitcom dad who is, loves his kids and stuff, but doesn't really express it. And remember, it's not necessarily about if they love their kids or not. It's about, if you were sitting taking notes, would you see these expressions of warm communication? Right? So in this scenario, the person would score low in that. So you might, if you're taking notes, you might want to add this as an easy sort of way to remember this. So authoritarian, low in the emotional communication, high in the rules, right? So red's like super strict. Authoritarian. And I would actually underline, if you're taking written notes or just bold or whatever, the Tarian end part, because you'll notice the second one's authoritative. So like my one critique of Bumrein's model is like it's brilliant, but why'd you pick two words that are basically the same? But I'll explain why I think she did on the next slide. Authoritarian parenting is a restrictive, punitive style in which parents exhort means like strongly pressure the child to follow their directions and respect their work and effort. The authoritarian parent places firm limits and control on the child and allows little verbal exchange. For an example, an authoritarian parent might say, "You do it my way or else." Authoritarian parents might also punish the child frequently, enforce rules rigidly but not explain them, and show anger towards the child. Children of authoritarian parents are often unhappy, fearful, and anxious about comparing themselves to others. They often also tend to fail to initiate activity and have weak communication skills as they get older. Again, some of these things sound kind of negative, and well, at the same time, you would probably expect in a child development course that I would say that parenting matters, right? And different styles of parenting are associated with different developmental outcomes. Just to segue back to the last slide a little bit and to make a bridge here, if you were taking notes there, it's like that last slide. So Red Foreman would have scored high in the rules part, but scored low in the warm emotional expression. And so that's how he'd be different to the example I'm making here of Uncle Phil from A Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Especially in his relationship with all his kids, but in the central relationship in the show, or at least one of them, is his relationship with his nephew Phil, right? And why it's authoritative. So this is why I was kind of going on that little mini rant there about authoritarian, authoritative. So think of the word authority is obviously the word that's the common root there for both. Now, to understand this easily, we just have to talk for a sec about the difference in the endings of those words, right? Like authoritative to mean that you're like that, authoritarian to mean that you're more defined by that. That's the main thing. That authority piece is the main thing. Red Foreman is the rules. So now, Uncle Phil's the rules too, but that's part of his game. It's a little more complex. Okay, so there's more of this focus also on warm relationships. So basically what I'm saying is this is the ideal parenting style in terms of developmental outcomes. This exists in a vast multitude of ways. The ways that this type of parenting style actually manifests in different families or whatever can be very different, but basically it's, if you're taking this scorecard, and actually, you know what, that'd be an interesting assignment or project for one of you, is to actually do that with a couple modern TV shows and just use her model and see how they would rate, how many of them would rate these different ways. That'd be a super cool project. That'd actually be a cool thesis for one of you too. Anyways, so authoritative parenting. Okay, so authoritative parenting encourages children to be independent, but still places limits and controls on their actions. Extensive verbal give and take is allowed. Parents are warm and nurturant towards the child. An authoritative parent might put their arm around the child in a comforting way and say, "You know, you shouldn't have done that. Let's talk about how you can handle that situation better next time." So again, it's not the disapproval is packaged differently. Authoritative parents authoritative parents show pleasure and support in response to their children's constructive behavior. They also expect independent, age-appropriate behavior. Children whose parents are authoritative are often cheerful, self-controlled, self-reliant, and achievement-oriented. They tend to maintain friendly relationships with their peers, cooperate better with adults, especially at school, right? So remember, we're talking about kids that are now going to school and interacting with like parents and the EAs and stuff like that. And they tend to cope better with stress. So in Canada, for example, if you were to rate all families, and they've done this in like smaller samples and then kind of inferred it larger, but the idea is that in Canada, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure if this is a Canada or North America statistic, but about half of families would score this, a bit more than half. So, which is a very good thing, because this is, if I haven't already said this, this is the developmental outcome from that perspective. What am I trying to say? I'm trying not to just say it's the best approach. I'm trying to say it's the parenting style associated most heavily with positive developmental outcomes on a wide range of variables. I think it's also important at a certain level to take a pause for a second, make the point of recognition that parenting is at times incredibly hard. And one of the reasons parenting is hard is because it's every single day. And so why I'm saying that is when you start talking about parenting styles, it's very easy to like, especially when I'm like literally talking about kind of scoring different parenting styles differently, it's very easy to come across or even to get into a mindset of where you're kind of order ranking them. And while there's value in this, because what is also really highlighting it, I hope, for you, is this idea of like structure combined with warm communication channels is sort of the key. It's important to acknowledge that there's just that it's tough. So anyways, that didn't necessarily tie perfectly to this slide. That would have, what I just said would have fit better at the end of the last slide, but because now I'm kind of switching to scenarios where this is the scenario where the person is scoring low on both those variables. Okay, so this is the exact opposite. So again, so that ramble I started this slide with kind of goes with the slide before, now that we're talking about Al Bundy. For the younger people in the audience, this was the grandpa from Modern Family when he was the dad on Married with Children. And this show is funny. This is like going back to my childhood more. And he was kind of like the dumb dad. He was like a shoe salesman. He was a funny character, but he was kind of like a dumb, kind of, not really necessarily even dumb, but like kind of rude, uninvolved, like, well, uninvolved would be the word. And so again, I think it'd be fascinating for some of you, if you're like, my references here are obviously dated, it'd be so interesting to maybe do like a modern comparison to something like this. Again, even if people wanted to do something like that, again, I think I've already said that. I don't have to keep saying that, but I think that there's lots of room for interesting comparative research on this. So neglectful, the reason why I say there on the slide neglectful and then I have underneath it uninvolved in brackets is because for as long as I've taught developmental psychology, this has been called uninvolved. And I've noticed in this textbook, and it made me look into it a bit, that the language sort of being used now is neglectful. But I wanted to have that included there just in case you looked into this, just so you know that people are sort of interchangeably, it seems like, using that language now. Neglectful parenting is a style in which the parents are involved in the child's life. Children whose parents are neglectful develop the sense that other aspects of their parents' lives are more important than they are. These children tend to be socially less competent. Many have poor self-control and don't handle independence well. They frequently have low self-esteem, act immaturely, may be alienated from their family. In adolescence, they may show patterns of increased truancy and delinquency. Right, and from a developmental perspective, you can hardly blame the kid. Right, so this would be, for your notes, this would be an example of low rules, low expression of warm emotional. Now so that doesn't necessarily imply that Al Bundy in this scenario doesn't love his kids. It implies that if you were taking score, you wouldn't have saw expressions of that, or maybe you saw some, but at a level that would have still scored in this low percentile compared to other families. This is all compared to other families. And then the last example comes from the great Tony Soprano. No, I don't know if I've told you this yet. This is one of my classic favorite shows. Sopranos are great. It's one of the most interesting psychological, because if you haven't watched the show, it's about Tony Soprano, who's this like mob boss, but at the same time and you see this in like the first episode, he starts having these panic attacks. So he's in this really interesting scenario where he's this basically like gangster, like mafioso gangster, Italian mafia in New Jersey, and he's like the leader, sort of like a John Gotti sort of character, but at the same time he's having these like intense anxiety panic attacks, and so he's going to a therapist. And so a lot of the show's like why it's so I almost said psychodynamic, but dynamic. That was a little bit of a slip, but it actually sort of is psychodynamic, especially his relationship with the counselor in all kinds of ways. And so it's just such a neat, the way that they did it that way, that they did it through the eyes of both who he was as like a mobster and who he was as a patient, and they just kind of juxtaposition that just so interestingly. Anyways, that was a minute and a half of me just hyping Sopranos. But again, like his relationship with, say, for example, his kids is what would be probably labeled indulgent. And again here, so this is for both of these ones where it was neglectful, and then I had in brackets uninvolved, and then this one where it was indulgent and then I have in brackets permissive. That's just an indication to you that for a long time permissive was the label for this category, and the labeling seems to have been updated, which often happens. So the only reason that really matters is that if you're doing research on it, just so you know, that indulgent parenting is a style in which parents are highly involved with their children but place few demands or controls on them. So again, if you didn't watch the show, so Tony would like, especially there was a period, and this isn't really given much away, where, how can I say this without giving away any plot? I can say it easily. Okay, so when Tony would be spending time with his kids, he loved them, he took great care of them, he's in a lot of ways spoiled them. But if you were to be critical of his parenting, what you would say is there was none of like the structure and rules and all that side of it. So indulgent is high in the expression, the warmth, low in the rules. So you might find this interesting, that one of the issues with the effect of divorce on kids is the switch from authoritative to more permissive parenting styles, and that has an effect on the kid. When you're looking developmentally at some of the main influences divorce has on kids, shift in parenting style is a very significant variable. I'm assuming in a program like, I know you're not all, I know all of you students aren't in the same, coming from the same program, but I know that all of your programs have, similar flavors in that you're getting into the helping professions with focuses on especially early childhood. Whether you're taking more of a social worker or a psychological or early youth perspective, you're probably taking classes dealing with some of the complex issues around child maltreatment, whether we're talking about the different types of abuse or whether we're talking about some of the causes and situational factors. It's tough, especially without having the ability to have conversation. It's tough to really kind of, because these are often things that what I found is when I'd be teaching about stuff, especially in class and with my students at Conestoga, they'd maybe be like, okay, well, how's this like this? And a lot of the examples they would give would be related to things like what are on this slide that add, it adds complexity to childhood when these things happen. I don't really know how else to say it. The developmental impact is significant. Right, this is in a lot of ways actually, this is sort of where social work hits psychology too. And understand, if for the people in the class that are interested in going in that direction, understanding all of this is so important because it's so important to being able to, it goes back to that, in a weird way, to the Vygotsky idea of the zone of proximal development. The more you understand the complexities of the situation, the more you can craft your intervention at a level that is a goodness of fit. I'm not sure at Nipissing what language you use if you talk about research methods, or if you talk about research design, or if you talk about like qualitative and quantitative research and research methodologies and stuff like that. All that language is pointing at just this idea of like, what are you trying to figure out and how are you trying to do it? And yeah, if you're interested in that, I did my master's thesis on quantitative like statistics and my PhD on qualitative like a phenomenological qualitative research. So that's kind of something that's like a big interest area of mine. So if I don't know your group, but well, I'm getting to know your group, and if you're interested in learning more about how to do like a study like that, let me know and I can incorporate some of that because that's an interest area of mine too. And the reason I got onto that rant was because I was going to say that in developmental psychology, a lot of the research that's done is what you would consider like observational data collection. Now, it would still probably, in a lot of ways, fall under quantitative statistics or like quantitative research, quantitative methodology, research design, whatever. And why I'm saying that is because what this first point is saying is like, say you're a researcher and maybe you're yourself right now, you're in your second year of university and you get hired as a job as a lab assistant for some developmental psychology researcher who's studying conflict, or basically like pushing and shoving and any kind of negative display between siblings. So what your job is to do in whatever situation the kids come into the lab for whatever time, whatever the person you're working for has already set it all up. Your job is to sit in through like a one-way mirror. Maybe you're just sitting on a chair in the room with everybody, however it's designed, and you have a pad of paper and a clipboard, and you're basically putting a tick mark every time you see any interaction that fits the criteria you've been sort of taught to count as like, if they push or if they take the toy from the person or whatever. And so all that was to say that what we see is that 2-year-olds, when you have two siblings together and they're both within that range of 2 to 4, we see that they have a conflict like every 10 minutes. You're like, holy Mike, could you have taken longer to explain that point? But observational data collection. The rate of conflict, though, what you see if you do that kind of data collection declines quite significantly as they get older. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. And a big aspect of it is this emerging verbal ability, right? So, and this isn't necessarily all positive. For example, with girls, and it'd be interesting if we were doing this live and you could ask questions or give your insights. It's like what we sometimes see is a huge decrease as girls start to go to high school, and a huge decrease in any kind of physical aggression, but a huge increase in verbal aggression and what's called like relational aggression, which means aggression aimed at damaging somebody's reputation as much as in contrast to like physical aggression that's maybe aimed at physical harm, which is more associated with boys. Again, generalizations, but that's sort of developmental psychology, is let's look at hundreds of thousands of people and find the averages, because that helps us understand, with wrapped in the understanding that obviously there's a wealth of diversity of expression on all these data points, because that's just what human life is. We're incredibly interesting. So a large portion of families have single parents, so there's interesting aspects of that too, like that obviously affects things also, and the amount of balancing that's needed, and the type of work that the parents are engaged in has a huge effect on that too. Like, not even to mention all the complexities around like the current situation with the pandemic and all this stuff. And here's what's an interesting idea that they talked about in the textbook, that how the work of the parent affects the kid mainly in the, oh man, and this is rough, because it's like when I get stressed out, it's like, and usually it's about just trying to keep caught up or whatever, just like everybody else, right? But it's like that energy is what the kid sees. It's like they don't overly care. Like, it's not like Evelyn cares, not that she doesn't overly care. She doesn't care at all about like any of my emails or anything, right? It's like what affects her is the energy I bring from that, right? So that's what sort of is not necessarily saying right there, but kind of within that comment, that what matters for children is the nature of the parent's work, more so than like the specific of it. Like, what's it like? Like, is it something that they're always away from the house, or are they at home? Like, does it put them in a terrible mood, or are they constantly worn down? Children in divorced families tend to sometimes have more adjustment issues, especially at school. And one really important point that I wanted to come back to is something I said earlier about one of the things that can be most challenging for kids is, well, there's the change in financial situation, there's the potentially the increased exposure to the parental conflict, but then another huge variable is this fact that this disruption of routine, whether that means like actually physically moving, whether that means changing schools, whether that means this shift in parenting style that I had mentioned earlier. And then this idea that during middle and late childhood, attachment becomes more sophisticated, it becomes more complex. The social world of the child starts to expand and include things like peers, and so like the other students and the teachers, and then these early attachment relationships with the parents start to get modeled out in this expanding social world. They're starting to spend less of their time with their parents. Think of like even my daughter today. I dropped her off at school at 9. My wife picked her up at 3:20. That's a huge part of her day that she's like now with the teacher and with her classmates. right? Like actual hours per day, she's probably around her teacher more than me. Like, I don't know, I wouldn't, like, it'd probably be close. But that's like a social influence that wasn't there before. So it's this emerging, so, and obviously you guys are like, yeah, it's just called school, but it's like, when you view it from the perspective of the child, it's this new world. It's the new, I said that weird, but it's this new world. So I don't have a specific reason necessarily for showing this graph, other than I thought you would just find it interesting that in Canada it's roughly 15% of families that are single parent. And it doesn't say there, but I believe this is as of 2016. Right, so that's a significant proportion. So I just want to make a few points here on this idea of this emerging school world and how it's a new world on so many different levels. It's a new physical place that they're going to. It's a new set of relationships. It's a new set of cognitive challenges. It's a new set of emotional challenges. It's actually one of the biggest, and I've never had as almost intimate connection to this idea as I do this term with, just because I know I've talked about it a lot, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of a little bit repetitive about it, but that my daughter's going to school for the first time, and so I'm like seeing this specifically, right? That like this emerging complexity of her social world is so fascinating to watch. As children grow older, they spend an increasing amount of time with their peers, children above or at about the same level of maturity, right? So just basically like their classmates. Peers, just friends, classmates, you probably already know that, but peer means, kind of implies person at your same level, basically. Right, so all of you students would be each other's peers. Good peer relations contribute to normal social emotional development, especially in middle and late childhood. Right, that's a pretty straightforward sentence, not super scientific or anything, but it's actually quite deep. That because what happens is, so think of how those two things link, right? It's like now a main social influence, the kid's not in the house as much, they're at school now a lot of the time, so then the quality of those school relationships have a huge developmental influence now. So now here's the interesting thing. This is a weird story that I stopped myself from saying earlier that I want to share now. So my daughter Evelyn has her friend at school, Jules, and I was asking her today. So I was like, yeah, so how was playing with Jules? And she was like, yeah, good, because I'm trying to get her to talk a little bit about her day and stuff, right? And she's like, I like Jules, but, and I was like, well, what? And she's like, she's nice, but she's not very good at sharing the pink toys. And it was just kind of funny, right? It's like, that's that reciprocalness. It's like, even at 4, my daughter's like, this girl's cool, but she'd be cooler if she shared a little bit more. And so it's interesting how, like, my daughter wouldn't have said that a year ago. That ability to kind of critique somebody else's behavior like that is a part of, and then see why school's so good for kids and why it's so important for Evie to be around other kids is she has to learn that it's not always what she wants, and sometimes it is what she wants, and sometimes it's a negotiated compromise, and sometimes there's competition, and sometimes there's cooperation, and there's these this is actually another idea in psychology by a guy named Hardup. It's like Hartup, I mean, and Hardup's idea of reciprocal, I forget what the second word is, but reciprocal interaction or something like that. But basically his concept is that it's like intimacy, cooperation, and competition are these three things that, or these three necessary aspects of child development that are sort of only learned at a peer level horizontally. What I mean by that is, like, it's very hard for a parent to teach that because the kids have to learn that through exposure to others at their level. It's why if you're homeschooling your kids, it's important to build that in somehow, right? Like whether you have your kid involved in like a martial art club or in sports or in whatever, right? To somehow, they need that social aspect, and I'm sure that a lot of homeschools somehow do that. So that's like I don't know why I'm talking about homeschools, but just that idea of how that's an important emergent social influence. So this is a kind of interesting concept too, this idea of these 6 functions of friendship. And not a Freudian slip, but that might have been like a Freudian omission. I didn't even mean to not say child friendship. It's like these are true for all of us, and it's in some ways you could almost flip this model and say some of the psychological strain caused by this COVID stuff has been how some of this has been affected for so many of us, right? That actually having companionship is deeply important for human beings. That this social emotional aspect of our lives is huge, and that these two things are combined, that there's that kind of emotional social aspect, but then there's also this kind of like physical cognitive engagement. Like the way I would think about it is like my daughter when we were isolated for a while there, and then all of a sudden, like I remember like the first time she played with her cousins and they just like ripped around the backyard, and it was like their bodies like needed that so deeply. It's like that being around other kids and just being kids. And physical support just meaning like they're like literally learning how to use their bodies, how to run around, how to play, how to do things. Humans are tool using creatures, like they're learning how to physically function through play. That it's actually, we're going to talk about kind of play specifically more in a second. This idea of it's actually support for their ego. And, I mean that at a very deep level of what ego meaning, like the part of me that's Mike, the part of you that you think of as you, that's not just your thoughts or your feelings or your memory. Remember that, like at the beginning, some of the language in the early writings of psychology called psychology ego psychology. Like, if you look at some of the pragmatists, William James, one of the great fathers of psychology, kind of the father of American psychology, talked about this ego psychology right around the same time as Freud. Those two are fascinating. William James. So anyways, he also, just one real quick thing. I know I'm getting a little bit rambly, but it's late at night and I've been drinking multiple coffees. But William James, The Varieties of Religious Experiences, or something like that. If you just put William James, Variety of Religious Experiences, probably the best book, in my opinion, maybe ever, trying to bridge the gap between psychology and religion or spirituality, or like he says, the varieties of religious experience. And he was, in that book, much less interested in trying to prove right or wrong or anything like that, and much more in how is it being experienced by people. It's just a fascinating book, and I got talking about that because of ego support. Number 5, this idea of one thing friendship does is it gives kids this important ability to make these comparisons, right? So I've been saying that so much of their understanding of who they are is comparison based, and that and then that last point is kind of maybe obvious, but just this ability, if it gives them the ability to have people that they care about and that are their, just friends, have affection and intimacy, and just have people care about and that they look forward to seeing and that look forward to seeing them. One thing I noticed when my daughter started school was that when she would come home at first, she'd be quite tired. And one of the reasons for that is that being in that new situation is very cognitively demanding in terms of energy, because there's a lot of social information processing going on. They're trying to make sense of this new environment. What is important to pay attention to? What is this person being nice to me or making fun of me? What social cues should I be paying attention to? So say that guy with his arm up, it's like, is that guy saying, hey, what's up, buddy? Or is he being like, hey, what's up, buddy? And with like a sarcasm that actually shows that he doesn't like me? How do I attribute intent? Meaning, like, why is he doing it? What's the intention? The attribute, the reason for the intention. So now think about it as like the kid, right? The kid turns the corner, sees whatever situation, has to selectively, remember we're talking about what's kind of cognitively, this cognitive information processing of the social situation. Their brain's like processing, what do I pay attention to? What's causing what? What am I trying to do in this situation? Generate goals. Trying to say, okay, I want this to happen. Now it's like the brain's like, okay, grab that script. Think even the language there, script. It's like, we know what to do in this scenario. Make a decision. Enact a behavior. So this is like, it's not like, obviously it's not like the person's doing this like they're like RoboCop or something, but this idea that like they turn the, just if you didn't get that reference, it's like that's, RoboCop was like, computer's like, turn left, engage target. It's like, it's not like the kid's thinking that way. But if you were trying to explain what was happening cognitively in, like if you just say, oh, it's complicated, that for Evie going into the new social situation of a first grade classroom where it's like a junior kindergarten, senior kindergarten split, there's new teachers, there's TAs, what even is the difference between a TA and a teacher to a 4-year-old? She's trying to understand that, what the different roles are. Some people are there the whole day, some people aren't. Instead of just saying that's a complicated situation, why is it complicated? Well, because she has to selectively attend to social cues, attribute intent, generate goals, access memorized behavioral scripts, make decisions, and then enact behavior. And all of that takes cognitive effort. I had mentioned earlier that I was going to at some point come back to this topic of play, because play is so important. And for a lot of you that are in the early childhood development focused programs, like, I probably don't have to tell you this, that play is so central to early childhood development. It actually is, but one thing that we may not talk a lot about is how central it is to helping children control anxiety, because so much of anxiety is actual physical pent up energy, and it's a opportunity to process some of that. Like, even I find with my daughter, if after school sometimes we'll go outside and just run around a bit and play and stuff like that, and that then she like behaves better when she comes inside, even because like she's you just kind of say like burnt off some steam, or just kind of like burnt off some energy. And when we say burnt off some energy, some of that is like kind of cognitive tension. That pent up the second point, pent up tension is released through play. That actually can help them learn that, well, develop healthy practices for later in life when they have similar pent up tensions. That this third one, that for young children, imaginary situations are real. I don't mean the fact that like they're hallucinating and they actually think it's completely real, but like to my daughter, when we're playing play worlds, that play world is a much more real thing to her than it is to me, right? Because we have this like adult, it's like to her, her active creation in her mind, her subjective experience is so much more immersed. So we won't spend a ton of time on this, but I want you to have this, because if you're looking into play, and I think why play is so interesting is because it's non-goal oriented activity. We've kind of touched on this a few times, but why that matters is that it's sort of activity for activity's sake, and there's all these developmental benefits associated with, especially during childhood, a lot of time being put into that. Now, not just in childhood, because actually if you're talking about like later in the course, which the second part of this, which is in the new year, and we're looking at things like increasing like neuroplasticity as we age, one way of doing that is the introduction of more play. You know, we can just call that hobbies, or we can call that serious leisure, or we can call it whatever term you'd like, but it's the same sort of idea. So anyways, what I was kind of leading to is just this idea of, let's just go over these quick. So sensory motor play, again, remember this word sensory motor, this Piaget word of the child that's experiencing so much of their world through their senses, through their vision, through their touch, through their taste, through their auditory channels, right? And then through their movement, motor behavior that allows infants to derive pleasure from exercising their sensory motor schemas. They're actually starting to learn what things are, what closing their hand does. It's like so basic, but that doesn't, no, basic's not the right word, fundamental would be the right word. That there's practice play, that as the kid's like kind of learning and practicing skills, and that's why a lot of early child play is so repetitive. You see this like pretense, or what we would call symbolic play. Pretense is kind of like so like the pretense of a show of like, say like Walking Dead or something. It's like if you can like accept the fact that it's in this like zombie world where zombies are a real thing, if you can accept that, then you can like enjoy the show or whatever. Pretense is like my daughter's being like, okay, you're the dragon, I'm the knight, go. It's like, that's the pretense, this like symbolic play. The child transforms the physical environment into this like symbolic play realm. The backyard becomes, you know, all of a sudden the deck is lava and you have to step over the lava, right? The classic kid thing. But it's like, my daughter does that too. It's like, again, she probably saw it in some show, because it's like the classic thing, right? Like my daughter loves that kind of thing. Like if she can't get enough of it, and I'm pretty open to that, and I'll play like a long time, because I really think that like that physical play is key, and it also has it's not just physical play. It's, as we've been talking about, it's burning off a lot of emotional and cognitive tension too, right? For me too. Like it's good for me. It's good for me to like do that as much as I can. Just being around that is good, and also just being active and outside and that stuff too is what I mean too. So then social play and the interactive piece. So social play, just this idea of this increased interaction, this increased play with others, and what I said earlier about that reciprocal interaction, or that the idea of William Hartup, that there's something that kids get at that horizontal level, peer level, right? Like kind of specifically intimacy, cooperation, and sorry, what's the other one? Oh yeah, collaboration, cooperation. Oh yeah, cooperation, competition, and intimacy. Sorry, if you're writing it down. And then constructive play, this idea of like practice play, that they're actually learning and playing out. It's like basically you can almost look at play, especially for the young infants, especially before they're doing social play. When you're looking at some of this constructive play or some of like the sensory motor play, it's this like safe place to learn behavior, basically. Right? And then once we start to get into games and actually, sports and stuff like that, it's adding more rules and structures, but it's still within this categorization of types of play. Okay, so I have homework for all of you. I want you to go on YouTube and Google ravens playing in the snow, because there's a clip that I always show in class, and I was going to just put it in this video, but who knows, it's got like the classic, it's from like the Nature Channel, it has the classic, like their classic theme music in the background, and so I don't know. YouTube's weird with stuff like that. So anyways, if you look it up, it's cool because the raven like just rolls down the hill of snow, gets back up, does it again, just like it's a human kid tobogganing. And the reason I'm saying that is play in the animal kingdom is a sign of intelligence. It's associated with longer childhoods. Longer childhoods are associated with more brain volume size for the size, so that brain volume size ratio, like, so an animal that has, so for example, humans have a huge brain for our size. For example, you know what I mean? So the classic example of that would be like a T-Rex having a small brain, although that's not necessarily true. They had complex brains, but anyways, I'm getting way off point. Play in the animal kingdom is a sign of intelligence and is associated with an extended childhood. That extended childhood is what gives the potential for that play, that play is associated with that brain development. So just that it's an extra layer here, that young mammals of all species play, and that one of the critiques that some people have of kind of our modern society is this decline of more free play, that we've become in some ways too structured and too much in the direction of organized sports. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge proponent, I'm a massive sports fan, and I think there's huge development benefits of things like sports and organized activities of all types, whether we're talking about music or art and drama and singing and sports and artistic endeavors of all kinds. But I think there's an argument to be made that there's, in addition to that, having opportunities for free play, it basically just also has benefit. It's not a one or the other. Right? And then again, all of this stuff is so concerning with this move to digitalization. Like, it's tough. There's complexities for even us, right? And I'm like an adult teacher and you're adult students, and it's like, and we're, decent with technology and all that kind of stuff. It's like, so it's been a switch for us college people, but for like the kids that aren't going to school, that switch is, the social switch there is so significant. Now, I actually shouldn't say that, because one thing I'm noticing is, and you're probably all feeling it, and I know my students in Kitchener are feeling it too, is people are missing campus a lot right now. And I'm sure a lot of you are feeling that too. And part of it is because, related to so much of this stuff I've been talking about, there's, at a certain point, it's like the power of place and the power of that shared meeting spot, just the campus. Like, man, I miss the campus. And yeah, so I'm not saying that like the shift for college students to being, and university students to being completely online isn't massive too. It's been such a crazy time for everyone, but the developmental impact on kids is especially concerning, is kind of what my point is. So, sorry, I feel like I got a little bit rambly there at the end of the presentation, but I think some of these things are complex, and I'm trying to also be honest, and so sometimes I get kind of caught because I'm trying to explain something deep kind of in the moment, but I think I hope that it made sense and tied together decently. So I want to kind of just do this because I know a lot of you might be watching this presentation, kind of maybe taking some notes, reviewing your notes, and then getting ready to do the quiz. So let's kind of, if you're not doing that and you want to do that later, you could pause the video and watch this later or whatever you want to do. I'm going to do kind of a review here. So the main points that we talked about today, and I've been doing this every week. I don't know why I took so much time explaining that, but basically the points in Erikson's theory, early childhood is a period when the development of the child involves resolving these conflicts around initiative versus guilt. And then as we get more into middle childhood, the next one is this industry versus inferiority. And these are the two ideas that we sort of started today talking about, and this idea that parents and then later teachers can play a big role in how this is experienced by the children. Children's understanding of themselves changes throughout childhood. So we talked about this idea of self-concept, like how they think of themselves in all these different ways, like how they see themselves, think of their concept of who they are. And domain specific just means like, domain means like area specific. So that means like how they think about themselves in their ability to do math, or their ability to write, or their ability to be an athlete, or if people like them or whatever. So self-concept refers to domain specific evaluations of the self. Self-esteem refers to these global evaluations, so how they think about themselves in general, and is also referred to sometimes as self-worth or self-image. Self-efficacy and self-regulation are linked to children's competence and achievement. Careful thought is needed to promote healthy self-esteem. Right, and I made that point that although the intentions are always good, there can be, it's not 100% always healthy, and that's why I said healthy self-esteem and not just self-esteem. Children's understanding of others becomes more adult-like as they develop perspective taking, right? So as they start to be able to put themselves in other people's shoes and understand what other people are thinking and how that's different than what they're experiencing, they kind of make this jump from the early stage to the next stage where they start to become, well, they start to make sense of their social world in a way that's more, as this says, adult-like. We talked about gender and how that refers to both kind of social and psychological dimensions of being male and female. We looked at psychoanalytic and social cognitive ways of emphasizing the role of how parents basically influence how the child experiences gender. Peers are especially adept at rewarding gender appropriate behavior. Young children, so we talked about this self-conscious emotion. So if you want to just think about that as this idea of like some emotions, like say being angered or frustrated, you could be completely by yourself and be frustrated. But to have shame or guilt, those are emotions that are born within a social context. Young children's range of emotions expand during early childhood as they increasingly experience self-conscious emotions such as pride, shame, and guilt. Children benefit from having emotion coaching parents. As children get older, they use a great variety of coping strategies and more cognitive strategies. So coping strategies and cognitive strategies to regulate their emotions. They also show an increased emotional understanding. Moral development involves thoughts, feelings, and actions regarding the rules and regulations about what people should do in their interactions with others. Remember, morals is about should, good, bad. Piaget proposed cognitive changes in children's moral reasoning, right? And well, cognitive reasons. Behavioral and social cognitive theorists argue that there's considerable situational variability in moral behavior. Interesting point. Number 7, perspective taking and social relationships both influence moral reasoning. Authoritarian, authoritative, neglectful, and indulgent parenting styles produce different results. That's a pretty blunt way of saying it. Authoritative parenting is a style most associated with children's social competence. 9, there's little evidence that physical punishment is beneficial. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about this. There's interesting discussion, and this is always a tough one sometimes in class, around physical discipline. The literature is what's called equivocal or equivocal. Like, basically you can find people arguing that there's benefits and disadvantages. Now, in Canada, there's very specific laws, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that there's little evidence. Well, I think the evidence is clear that physical punishment, or I'll just say it how it's written there, there's little evidence that physical punishment is beneficial, and it can lead to child maltreatment in the forms of physical abuse, child neglect, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse, and those risks far outweigh whatever proposed benefit. Siblings interact with each other in positive and negative ways. Parents can help children to navigate conflict. So some of these points aren't like word for word things I said, but they're just kind of summaries. In general, having both parents employed full-time outside the home hasn't necessarily been shown to have negative effect on children. Now, that's a bit of a summary of a point from the textbook, but I sort of hit on that when I was saying this idea of like what they were saying in that study was that it was the emotional vibe sort of that the parent brought home that the kid responded to, right? And I was talking about how like Evelyn doesn't care about my emails or about even how good I do like a presentation like this. Like, what she'll notice is when she comes into the room if I'm stressed or not. Parents spend less time with children during middle and late childhood than in early childhood. New parent-child issues start to emerge as the kids now going to school. Discipline changes. Control becomes more co-regulatory, meaning like now the child's starting to take they're maybe not completely self-regulatory, but they're not also completely dependent. They're starting to kind of take some control over themselves in all kinds of ways, maybe calming themselves, maybe behaviorally, like actually getting dressed and breakfast and all that kind of stuff. If divorced parents develop a harmonious relationship and practice authoritative parenting, children's adjustment improves. Peers are powerful socialization agents, or people that have an agent is somebody that has an effect and can choose how their effect exists. Having agency over your life means that you're actively crafting it intentionally. Peers provide, or not always intentionally, but actively. Peers provide a source of information and comparison about the world outside the family. Peer statuses, we didn't get really into peer statuses, but this idea of like, well, we did. We just didn't necessarily get into this popular children, neglected children, neglect, controversial, average. You're not going to need to know that for the test, but basically just this was another idea that the textbook brought up, and just classifying kids, basically just this idea that social status, the importance of it changes as the kids age. They care about it more or less depending on age. And we're going to see that especially as we get into the teenage years next. Like my daughter, as a 4-year-old, might care what her friends think, but nowhere near as much as she will when she's 14. Children who are friends tend to be similar to each other. Children's friends serve a number of functions that we talked about. Among the most widely studied types of children's play are sensory motor, practice, pretense symbolic, social, constructive, and games. All right, two more. Number 19. Play serves several important functions, including affiliation with peers, tension release, advances in cognitive development, exploration, the provision of a safe haven. There are serious concerns about the decline of play in North America. 20. Although media has benefits, the extensive amount of time young children are spending watching various media is troublesome. Watching TV violence and playing violent video games has been linked to child aggression, although we'll maybe talk about that later because it's been linked, but that's super. There's a lot of complexity there. Engaging with media is associated with obesity, takes time away from other forms of play. For chapter 6, I hope that was okay and you learned a few things. Um, chapter 7 coming soon. Hang in there, we're almost there. Keep working hard. You're gonna be at the break in no time. So this is these mid to late weeks of November are always tough, demanding. You know, you get pushed and stressed to the point, but this is where you show your strength and your resolve. So keep fighting, keep working hard. Cheers.